as an educational leader in New York and the Gulf, and she trains educators as an Apple profession learning specialist on integrating technology into the classroom, and she also holds a PhD in educational technology and design. Yes, you guys may commence with your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Before I'd like to get started, I'd like to just make a single correction. I am affiliated with IQOU Theological College in the US, so that bio is just different. Thank you very much. Welcome to When the Marginalized Exceeds the Mark, African American Success in Higher Education Emerging from One Underrepresented Community in the United States. Hello, my name is Dr. Safwa. I'm an educational technologist at IQOU Theological College, and my research interest is education, education, education. I'm also here with my colleague, Mr. Abdul-Mannaan, who's a neuroscientist and researcher also at IQOU Theological College, and his interest is in the underlying educational and health inequities. Today, I'm going to talk about our study, and we're going to do that together. I'm going to share the larger study, the background, the gap in the literature, and he's going to focus more on the methods, the results, and the synthesis of findings. So before we get started, though, I do want to let you know that what you're going to see today is a part of a larger study. And we were able to share our preliminary findings in May 2024 in the United States in Virginia. So let's talk about the background of our study, our what and our how. So if you're not aware, like many communities, the United States has multiple ethnic groups. And the majority ethnic groups are usually white Americans, Asian Americans, Black Americans, and Latino Americans. And when it comes to higher education, unfortunately, in the United States, higher education is not equitable. And what you might find, and especially supported by research, is that African Americans and Latino Americans are often left behind when it comes to higher education. But we noticed something. There was one faith-based US community that was doing exceedingly well in higher education. And when we looked at that group and took a snapshot of that faith-based US community over the last 50 years, they had a spike in higher education. And let me give you an example. From 2010 onwards to 2024, these individuals, their average educational attainment was a bachelor's degree or higher. And so we went to the literature. What kind of research is going to support us in finding out what are those predictors that are responsible for their success? But we didn't find that in the research. Most studies showed inequities, Black versus white, male versus female, and very few focus on the within group predictors that are responsible for success. So we found our gap in the literature, examining the mechanisms that influence educational attainment within minority communities. There was very little research out there doing that. So our research question was, what are those predictors influencing educational attainment within this specific faith-based African American community? What was happening? Why were they doing so well? So our data collection process was simple. We conducted a survey. 268 respondents from that community completed the survey, men and women aged 18 to 80 years. The survey was really simple. It first allowed them to identify that they were in fact a part of this faith-based community. We asked about their age, their gender, whether they were a homeowner, what degree did they have, did they receive government assistance, what was their parents' education. About 31 plus questions we asked, and we measured it against educational attainment to see what we would find, because we were curious about what were those predictors for success. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Mr. Abdul-Mannaan, and he's going to share the methods.
Thank you very much, Dr. Safwa, for that introduction. So, as was mentioned, we had administered a 31-item predictive instrument to kind of isolate what the drivers of education were for this specific community. And we implemented a 5-step analytical process to filter through the noise and find what was actually moving the educational needle for this community. So step 1, we needed to take all of the qualitative data and turn that into quantitative numbers so we can then do deeper analysis. We then took a look at that data and did exploratory data analysis where we basically did a health check. And we wanted to identify which variables showed enough variability for deeper testing. Once that was done, we then could move on to bivariate association testing, where we used Pearson and point biserial correlations to isolate the meaningful signals. And this ensured that we were only capturing the factors that showed real, measurable relationship. And I think our most crucial step was in step 4, where we took all the factors that showed meaningful relationship in step 3, and we analyzed them into one bucket via ordinary least squares model. And this allowed us to assess each significant factor individually and to reveal its unique impact on educational attainment. And once we did that, we then could assess or analyze the predictive instrument as a whole, where we get our R-squared value, and this would determine exactly how much of the educational story this predictive model could explain. So, from this pipeline, there were 6 determinants that emerged with revealing associations. They were across demographic, intergenerational, and socioeconomic themes. It must be noted that these motifs that are listed here, they are shared across most if not all demographics, but the trajectories do differ. So measuring these determinants against what the national or international literature says allows us to tease out the unique story of this specific cohort. So we'll talk about these now. So we know from national literature, it frames education as a front-loaded investment that typically plateaus around the age of 29 because individuals are entering the workforce. However, our data painted a different picture. When we compared age to higher education, there was a strong persistence effect with a correlative strength or an R value of around 0.32, meaning as individuals in this community had aged, they continued to reach higher academic milestones where education here was a lifelong journey rather than a plateaued investment. So while age showed the journey's length, our next variable kind of explains the engine behind it. This was somewhat interesting. We know from meta-analytic data that maternal education is the strongest background predictor of academic achievement, and our findings did align with that as well. It was our strongest predictive determinant with a beta value of 0.22, basically meaning individuals were more likely to achieve higher levels of schooling when their mothers were higher educated as well. And interesting enough, this female influence was also revealed when we measured for gender. Historically, postgraduate success does favor males, and broadly speaking, this still is the case. Our cohort reflected a current shift where females are closing in that gap. So what we found was a predictive value of around 0.53, meaning ladies had overtaken men in this cohort in achieving higher education. So having examined these predictors that aligned with the established trends, we can now turn to some findings that challenge them or were against the conventional literature. We know from this aspect called the resource dilution theory that states the more siblings a family has, those resources are spread across that unit, and it leads to lower educational attainment. However, our cohort was a little bit different than that. The larger the family was, the higher education individuals in that family had achieved. It actually had a correlative value of about 0.7, meaning larger families were not associated with diminished educational outcomes. And I think our most revealing finding was regarding our socioeconomic factors. I think it's fair to say that socioeconomic determinants are traditionally the strongest predictors of educational attainment, often shaping access to educational resources and opportunities. However, our model revealed correlation coefficients of near zero for both home ownership and government assistance, meaning our SES predictors were not significant influencers in the positive or negative direction, suggesting that the conventional wealth penalties or benefits that influence other cohorts were not at play here. So to kind of sum up and review our factors, of the 31 items that we had screened, there was a small set that showed meaningful association. Age, maternal education, and gender were associated as influential determinants. In contrast, family size and the SES factors were not strong predictors, indicating that the conventional indicators were not primary drivers of educational outcomes in this cohort. So to assess our model as a whole, we get an R-squared value of about 0.19, meaning that 19% of the variation in educational attainment was explained by these predictors itself. And from a complex social outcome standpoint, this reflects meaningful explanatory power while also indicating that other factors are at play. So to place these findings in the broader context of educational equity, I can pass this on to the Dr. Safwa, and she'll discuss the conclusions and significance.
Okay, so before I discuss the conclusions and significance, I'd like to get a show of hands. How many of you, and if you could just raise your hand, believe that equitable access to education is a global issue? It's not a US issue, that's right. Thank you for that. So because of that, that is what helps us to believe and feel that our conclusions are very important. The questions that we asked this community, the approach that we did to finding out what the predictors are, they can be utilized to identify what helps marginalized or other groups and individuals pursue and achieve higher education. We also found out that money and wealth are not the only predictors for whether a person will finish higher education, and that's super important. So this is a call to action for governments, policymakers, stakeholders. We have a key takeaway, and that is every community succeeds in different ways. So therefore, more targeted research is needed that is community specific. So at this particular point, I'd like to ask you to think of any questions that you have, but before I do that, I do want to share some limitations of the study. The fact that there was limited generalizability. So we only tested one community, okay? We also had restricted socioeconomic measures where we did not directly ask about salary, and this was based on privacy. We also thought about a limitation that was related to self-reported data, where people may not have been honest, maybe they had some social desirability to appear a certain way. And design bias could have been a factor as well in limiting the study, whereas researchers, we may have missed some factors, but this is exactly what I'm calling out for. That is an area for future research. So without further ado, thank you very much, and we'll take you some questions. Also, if you are looking for copies of our presentation, you can scan the code. We'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to note that lifelong learning continues and there's no plateau there. That's very, very good. And also that money and large families are not going to be restricting people from studying. That's really good. I think we all were happy to hear those results. Okay, questions and comments? Okay, we have one.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for a very good research. It's very relevant. We can actually relate to the issues and the message that the study is trying to convey. This is just a clarification. Because in your in the last presentation, you mentioned you identified the limitation, particularly on determining some other factors that could have been included to enrich further the analysis. So do you think that the culture or cultural mindset or framing would have been also a very significant factor that could have influenced the home structure as an important determining factor for educational success?
Yes. I'll let my colleague, Mr. Abdul-Mannaan, answer that.
I think, without the shadow of a doubt, that would be something that we would need to consider. One of the motivations when selecting the questions for this specific survey is we kind of had somewhat of a pulse on the community that we were investigating. And so that kind of led us to what questions we wanted to select based off of what we had already known about the cohort. And the fact that we had a R-squared value of 19 definitely means if we were to do any follow-up studies, we would include that factor to see to what extent it was influencing educational attainment. And I'll add to, when we were discussing or looking at the data, there were other determinants that we could have included, such as school quality, access to schooling, busing versus cars and things of that sort. But we didn't want to have what you call self-reporting fatigue. If the questionnaire was too long, then we would be afraid that the cohort wouldn't want to participate. So we considered those in our design.
Thank you. So another round of applause for them, please. Thank you so much. So let's go to our next presenter. So what we're going to do is we just have only 2 more presenters left. Remember at the beginning of the session, we did